Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Deep Talks, exploring theology and meaning making. Today I'm joined by Graham Dempsey, who I have to confess, for those of you that have gone through my lecture series on Metamodernism, I'm indebted to. I referenced Brendan's work quite a bit. He's got a great series of YouTube videos out there, but not just YouTube videos. He's also a writer and author, and he has written a 7-volume series called the Metamodern Spirituality Series, and most recently, Metamodernism, or the cultural logic of cultural logics. And so Brendan, I really do consider to be, maybe he wouldn't think of himself this way, but I will heap some praise on him. I consider Brendan to be one of the leading voices addressing what's happening in our cultural moment right now with the metamodern shift. And so many of you have been really fascinated by this topic and subject matter. So I thought I want to bring on an expert. I don't claim to be an expert, but I'm going to bring on an expert here to discuss what's happening. Many of you are feeling like, as you're engaging with storytelling and the arts, and you're seeing these spiritual shifts happening, these religious shifts happening, you're going, what is going on? And so Brendan is here today to help maybe try to put a name to some of it, help us understand where we've come from, where he maybe predicts this is all headed. So Brendan, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great. I'm excited. I've been watching your videos, really enjoyed the conversations you're having with people like John Vervaeke and Paul Vanderklay. And just think you're putting out some excellent content. And I'm excited to see what we dig into.
Yeah. Okay. So for me, Brendan, I don't think I had a name for this right away, and it took me a while to give a name to what I felt I was picking up on, in particular in pop culture, noticing like aesthetics shifts in storytelling. I think first found myself intrigued by what seems like a shift from Charles Taylor's secular age into what I consider to be like a kind of a new epoch. We're like on the bleeding edge of it, or what I've called the post-secular age. We're also emerging out of what I think is probably the death of the new atheist movement into this new era in the West. And then I started noticing this shift in storytelling, aesthetics, the arts, and I found philosophers and people like yourself describing this after postmodernism shift as metamodernism. When and where did you first become aware that something was shifting in the philosophical landscape, the worldview landscape, the religious, the cultural stories that we're telling? When did you first become aware of it? And maybe what were some of the things that first tipped you off to, something different than postmodernism is happening here?
Yeah. So for me personally, I would say I discovered metamodernism, which is this term that people are talking about to give a name to some of these shifts. I discovered that back in 2013. And to be honest, for me, it was in the context of really seeing still a lot of very much kind of the postmodern zeitgeist, all around me in the arts. I was raised on, very postmodern films and television and whatnot, as well as, there was kind of an interesting dance between that stuff coming in, but also I was raised in a very Christian family, growing up, rather conservative Christian family. So those things kind of mixed in an interesting way. But it was out of my sort of dissatisfaction and kind of a disaffectedness with a lot of the contemporary zeitgeist that I went looking in the first place to see what people were talking about that might be out there that was beginning to emerge. I mean, I was, from a young age, actually really interested in the films of, say, Wes Anderson, and some other interesting stuff that was starting to emerge that had a slightly different kind of vibe to it. But I certainly didn't have any kind of a name or a rubric to use. So it was around 2013 when I was traveling. I was living in Europe at the time, and was trying to just make sense around the aesthetic shifts that we would really now call postmodernism, like the shift that had become very just permeated society in terms of the aesthetic register that was operating with that so-called cultural logic, and seeing, is this where this ends? Is this where this all, culminates, or is there something past the postmodern? And that's how I discovered the work of these Dutch cultural theorists who are talking about metamodernism. And what's been partly fascinating about tracking this is that it's been over the past, 10 years, right? That seeing what was sort of initially kind of hinted at or beginning to be described at that point has really kind of flowered and come to fruition in a big way in the last decade. So, for me, it wasn't so much looking around, seeing big changes and then being like, what's this called? It's more like getting intimations of some shifts and changes, and myself being kind of an evidence of sort of like an exhaustedness with postmodernism and a looking beyond it, and then finding this thing and then seeing it really kind of, increasingly accurately describe the kinds of shifts since then. So yeah, that was my experience with the term.
You mentioned already here a couple times, I think you just used the word exhaustion about the way that the postmodern frame was impacting you. And I think, as you know, I'm 40. Much of my formative teenage years, like you, growing up in a very conservative evangelical context, I was still engaging with the broader, I mean, we had our evangelical subculture with all its DC talk and tooth and nail record bands and things like that. And I'm sure you probably got into as well.
Oh yeah.
But within that subculture, of course, we're plugged into a larger culture, the culture, the meta culture over top of that. And of course, much of what was going on in my formative heyday were movies like Fight Club. Even, in many ways, like Seinfeld was a shift away from modernist forms of comedy into something that was self-aware, was, I think Larry David famously had a line on the set that, we're going to make sure that there's no hugging and nobody learns anything in each episode. Right. Which was such a critique, maybe a comedic sort of nihilism, but a critique of the sitcom genre. So I very much can identify with that. But when you talk about it leaving you feeling exhausted, can you put your finger maybe on what was producing that sense of exhaustion or dissatisfaction with that worldview, the worldview that was supposed to be the critique, really, of all worldviews?
Yeah. I mean, at the aesthetic level, there's just a sense of, it becomes a tired trick after a while, right? It's just, you've seen it so many times. And once you start to have some language for it, you're like, oh yeah, there that is again. So that's largely what I mean by exhaustion, just the sense of like, oh, this again. And by this, I mean things like, you walk into an art gallery and there's like, I don't know, glitter and paint smeared on the ground. And then there's like a little artist statement that's like, untitled number 18, and the little artist statement says something like, this piece seeks to problematize our relationship with ... And, when that stuff first starts to show up, you might be like, oh, this is kind of interesting, right? But like the opposite of interesting is boring. And so what I think happened with a lot of postmodern art was it just reached this point of saturation in the culture that it wasn't interesting anymore, which is sort of its claim to fame. And instead, it was just increasingly boring. And so that's mostly what I mean by exhaustion. So there's that, though there is a worldview component to that as well, in the sense of, to the degree to which those sorts of aesthetic strategies are connected to the sort of broader, worldview of sort of, nihilism, cynicism, skepticism, right? There is a point in which that is itself kind of a tiredness. A lot of the things that characterize the postmodern period are its sense of an end. I think Jameson described that as, right. Everyone was talking about the end of art and the end of this and the end of the death of the author and the end of history, and everything was ending. And so everyone was sort of exhausted about everything. It was sort of a cultural logic of exhaustion. And a lot of the kind of aesthetic strategies, I think, reflected that. So you get exhausted by exhaustion, and that's a kind of meta move, I suppose, that sort of starts to gesture towards, what's beyond that. What happens when you start becoming skeptical of skepticism and a bit cynical towards the cynics, right? It's sort of inevitable that you're probably going to lead towards something a bit more affirmational, positive, exuberant, idealistic, etc. So, yeah.
How do you understand, and I've talked about this in my series, but I think it'd be helpful to hear another vantage point on this. How do you understand the shift from modernism into an appetite for that sort of aesthetic art and storytelling, what do you think the primary factors were that led from that modern shift to the postmodern shift to make it probably something at some point which had some value? I know I want to be clear, because there's a lot of conversation, particularly in the sorts of internet spaces that might be adjacent to your work and our work, where there's a lot of kind of postmodern boogeyman stuff out there, right? Which is like, this was the worst thing to have ever come about, and it was all because of this weird cultural Marxism, whatever that means. Was there any validity to the initial shift from modernism? What were the postmodern storytellers, artists, and thinkers, what were they trying to grasp at? And do you see there being any continuing value for any of what postmodernism was grasping at, that you see this needs to continue? And in the metamodern shift, it seems to be continuing to be held on to as something valuable.
I think it's a great question. It's an essential question, and I feel like you won't really get metamodernism if you don't get that that's an important thing to be asking. So I think you're exactly right. There's a lot of easy boogeymanning and straw manning of postmodernism. And to be fair, these are big terms that are supposed to encapsulate a whole bunch of different things, right? So a lot of the time, I think we're often just talking past each other. And so we should be aware up front that, like, these are big categories. They're fuzzy. People will be using these terms slightly differently. But I think that, if, as I'm sure we'll get into in a minute, if metamodernism, which is what comes after postmodernism, is doing so by means still of postmodernism, then we have to take seriously the notion that something from this reaction carries forward. And as for what that is, there's so many angles you can take on this, and I think they're all relevant, they're all valid, and I don't want to, get too much into the weeds or too much over people's heads and try to deal with too much here. But I'll just name a few components of it. Right? There's at least, let's say, a historical, cultural moment, which I think really pushes us in this direction, and it largely comes after World War II. So let's step back a little bit, right? The modern, of course, is in itself kind of responding to the traditional worldview and a religious worldview, and a lot of what had come as sort of the emergence of modernity and modernism. It was about sort of trying to you could call this sort of the modern project, right? Like, create something after the dissolution and the rejection of maybe more traditional religious narratives, right? So you get new kinds of grand narratives about reality, that it's about progress, that there's this evolutionary direction that's sort of leading cultures towards, new heights. You see this, and then this glorification of technology gets wrapped up with this. So the modern is about the new and the novel and the technological utopia that we're sort of all gloriously heading towards. And sort of providing a new grand narrative of history that is not the sort of kind of classic Christian narrative that had been, the one to prevail throughout the entire, medieval period, essentially. Now it's a different narrative, and it's rooted in this world and all those things I just said. And I think that once you see what happens with World War II and how it just sort of just cuts the legs out from under that, I think that's really important for understanding the rise of postmodernism, because a number of things happen there. Basically, this utopian, aspirational dream vision of history, doesn't lead to utopia. It leads to the Gulag and to Auschwitz, essentially. And so, and technology starts being very much clearly seen for the ways that it destroys as well as creates, the way that it alienates as well as, brings people together. And so, really just the whole period from World War I to World War II, which is really sort of a big, colossal one war with sort of an, interim period.
Halftime.
Yeah, basically. And it's just this utter destruction of the old world. And I think that creates a sense of disenchantment with the entire modern project, and forces people to reevaluate, the ideals of liberalism and Enlightenment values, and supposedly this emancipatory project that modernity was. It seemed to lead to this iron cage. So you get, after World War II, people who are critical of these sorts of things, critical of the ideals and all that. And that leads to an attitude of skepticism. It leads to an attitude of cynicism, right? It's sort of like, oh, whose big narrative are you pushing at me today, right? It's like, we've been here before. There's this, there's this profound distrust, or hermeneutics of suspicion, right? So it makes sense that people like Freud and Nietzsche and Marx come in to try to, But even, of course, and this is where part of this issue around like the cultural Marxism bit becomes really problematic, is that like even Marx had a grand narrative, right? So what's so interesting about this postmodern moment is like, no, even the Marxists are out the window because they're pushing some story. And so, once you've eschewed grand
story progress too.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just,
right. It's taking that Hegelian dialectic and moving it into a materialist frame.
Yeah. And certainly a lot of those ideas had a direct link to what you see happen in World War II, and then, of course, the aftermath of the Cold War. So you get, I think, a profound disenchantment, disillusionment with this whole way of looking at the world. And there's a kind of self-protective element that goes with that as well. It's sort of like, all right, I won't believe anything, And so nihilism, of course, is sort of a natural product of that. So anyway, there's a kind of cultural historical moment that sort of makes sense for why those ideas would start to be on the rise. There's also, technological things that happen. There's, you could say, sort of evolutionary complexification, developmental angles that can be brought to this narrative. I could go on and on. So there's really a whole set of things that kind of explain why all of a sudden you start seeing this emergence of these ideas. But maybe more importantly, though, to get to the heart of your question, which is like, what sort of carries forward from that, that is of value. And I will say this, that like a big thing that these critiques did was they forced us to be more sort of, demanding of what we took as true, right? It's sort of like, there's this critique of authority and these appeals to, oh, well, this is the story, this is the narrative, or this is the political, message or what have you. There was sort of this sort of standing back and being like, well, no, we're not going to just, buy whatever bill of goods you're selling. We're going to really interrogate them. Ideally, right? And so one of the positive things that does come from that is a critique of certain modern presumptions that had been taken for granted, which are now start to be sort of exploded, right? Because once you start asking, well, for who is this story, serving, or what, to whose benefit does this particular message work? Then you're starting to become more aware of, the exclusionary dynamics that go into selling stories and grand narratives, and sort of like who's being left out, who's being oppressed, who's being used and exploited. So these issues become very salient to postmodern critiques of things. And basically, in the absence of this is the true story of history, all you've kind of got then is critiques of power and privilege to be able to fill in that gap. And so some of that is legitimately very valuable. I mean, we need to be asking those kinds of questions. And I think that the things like the civil rights movements that come in the 60s, are a big product of, those cultural forces shifting. Really much of the kind of cultural and sexual liberation and revolution kind of is a product of some of these, presumed axioms of sort of modern thought being sort of exploded and having new opportunities to be critiqued and whatnot. So anyway, I could say a lot more about that, but I guess I would just say that I think we should be asking more about systems, right? What are the contexts that we're operating in? Let's see the things that we're using to make sense of reality and examine those, right? So there's this moving back and stepping back from the ideologies or the frameworks that you're using to make sense of reality and interrogating those. And all of that I find to be very useful. And so when you start getting into metamodernism, there's certain aspects in which we can't just throw that stuff out. We shouldn't. There's profound insights to be gained from appreciating that we are in social contexts, that humans do a lot to construct those contexts, and that we shouldn't just take as sort of natural givens, things that we are enculturated into, and we should interrogate them. And that really starts to set you up into a new place where you're able to see cultural logics as, objects of analysis and not just things that you see the world through. And then that can really, start to put you in a position where you're where you have a cultural logic of cultural logics, which is kind of what the book is about.
The core of cores, right? I don't know if you saw this or have seen this trend on YouTube and TikTok called core.
No, I haven't.
So this is really fascinating, and I think this has connection to the aesthetic interests of metamodernism. So, side tangent here, and I want to come back to some of the stuff you said about postmodernism and connect it here too. But the core movement is this, again, like really a vibe, as my kids would say. it's a aesthetic vibe that gets at. So you might have genres on TikTok and YouTube, like YouTube Reels, for example, or YouTube Shorts, of these different cores. I'm going to butcher some of the other ones, like home core, or these different cores that are trying.
Yeah.
And so the
cottage
core. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right. And of course, in music, you had hardcore music, metalcore.
Yeah.
What's at the core, and so core is trying to get at like what is at the core of cores, and these are really fascinating vignettes into I think like the psyche of Gen Z right now, which tends to, from my vantage point, address the meaning crisis differently than millennials and Gen Xers did. Much of which I think has been marked by a sort of like comedic nihilism, where Gen Z is much more. This is when I noticed a shift happening, Brendan. It was probably my last few years of teaching in a classroom. The biggest thing I started to notice was how differently Gen Z was engaging the subject of September 11th from old millennials like me. When I noticed that they were not only comfortable, but like they loved sharing like 9/11 memes, and getting humor out of them. It was like a strange form of gallows humor.
Yeah.
Whereas that would be almost like a sacred, untouchable subject to millennials and Gen Xers in particular. Like that was so devastating. And I noticed boys in particular, 17, 18 years old, like passing along 9/11 memes, which I like found offensive, but it was kind of their way of processing the anguish of living in this particular moment. But core, these videos are often set to like just a really, they seem to be not coherent scenes spliced together, but there's a general aesthetic or vibe of melancholy, very, very depressing underneath that. And you might see spliced together scenes from kind of these like Sigma male anti-hero figures that you see in like the Literally Me videos out there, like a Patrick Bateman and scenes from those sorts of movies. But it's set to, it's fascinating because you're talking about the cultural logics of cultural logic, like what's at the core of cores. And to me, I see that connecting to what seems to be happening for those of us who postmodernism maybe was our native tongue. And so all we knew was primarily irony, cynicism. I mean this at a folk level. As you mentioned already, postmodernism is far too complex. But folk postmodernism, the Fight Club postmodernism, maybe the Rick and Morty postmodernism, that genre. Seeing at the end of that, people feeling that they have, in some sense, taken the sledgehammer of deconstruction to their overarching stories, to their guiding stories, deconstructed them all for many people. And, I don't know much of your personal story, but I'm sure there's a sense in which we can both identify with the disillusionment that many people our age experienced with traditional religion, and feeling as if there has been a use of those stories to continue to victimize people. And when you combine that postmodern critique, that overarching stories mask a play for power to continue to oppress and victimize. And then you've actually seen firsthand improper, immoral behavior. You've seen scandals. It seems to only strengthen that case. But I think, from my vantage point, that exhaustion that we feel at the end of that still leads us to this deep desire to actually live in some sort of story. How is the metamodern shift attempting to address that desire, that exhaustion, and that need to live in some sort of story that provides positive reconstruction, that provides you a way of actually speaking sincerely without throwing out all of what have been really valid critiques of postmodernism? How does it use the language and aesthetic of postmodernism to attempt to inhabit a meaningful story, to say things that are true, good, and beautiful once again? How do you see that working from your vantage point?
Yeah, well, I think that what you're naming is like a really significant dynamic of metamodern thought. And I think once you see that kind of thing is going on, that I think is sort of the answer to the question, but it's sort of like it happens in different ways, right? So if, broadly speaking, this postmodern move is to deconstruct and to, subject to interrogation and hermeneutics of suspicion, and it can do that in multiple ways, including, we'll leave it there. So like, that's one thing that it's doing, but it does differently. I think the metamodern move is sort of an attempt to say, okay, yes, okay, now what? Let's reconstruct and let's try to, as you say, maybe live in a story while owning it's a story or what have you, and recognizing that happens in different ways. So one way that I see that happening is in, okay, so there are different instances. I'll use one as an example. One is Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is a kind of explicitly metamodern work of art. The directors, Daniels, said as much. They're like, yep, we're aiming for like a metamodern thing here. And if you watch that movie, it's all about meaning. It's about nihilism. All right. It's about how do we make sense and purpose of our lives in the context of this infinite multiverse in which anything could be anything. And one sort of the kernel of the response there comes at the end of the movie, which is something like nothing matters given that. Therefore, everything can matter. And some people might find that rather unsatisfying. I wouldn't entirely blame them if they did so, but that is one thing that you see. And there are elements, actually, speaking of Rick and Morty, in which that shows up. It's sort of like, hey, no one's supposed to be here on purpose. There's no plan. Just, come and sit and hang out with your family, sort of a thing, right? So there's this move towards, which you see also at the end of Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is like, the main character chooses to be with this particular family at this particular laundromat in this vast galaxy of universes because, this is her world, essentially. So there's I think a move towards sort of reaffirming the value of sort of local meaning making and sort of recognizing that things could be an infinite number of other ways, that there's no sort of foundational ground, and yet we can affirm the value of our lived context. You could say we can choose the story and then put a lot of weight onto that story.
Very existentialist move.
It is. I think it even goes a bit further than the existentialist, to the degree that, I don't know, I get the impression from a lot of existentialists that there's a sense that there's still something inherently of value in making meaning, that somehow like the meaning making thing is the thing. But in this, it's sort of like, nope, even that is just sort of, you can deconstruct that, but we still need to do these things. So there's an element to that. I see that narrative crop up in metamodern spaces. I see kind of similarly this sort of approach around owning the social constructedness of things, but again, sort of affirming that, well, this is the condition of all knowledge. So this is just kind of how all knowledge works. And so, I grew up in this story and you grew up in this story. I think I've seen you mention some of these kinds of frameworks you're in some stuff you've said, and that there's some recognition that that's how things work, and then just sort of owning and accepting it, and then kind of living into that story. That's another approach. I'm very interested in trying to find sort of places where meaning actually does have some kind of how would I put this? it kind of grounds out in some significant way still. So it's not just a choose your own adventure. It's like, oh no, like this is kind of how this works. Even though it admits of a lot of variability. So like, for example, very kind of simplistically, if you want to say that like older forms of meaning where like meaning just has objective existence, it just is, right? Like things mean, maybe that has a very kind of naive traditional religious kind of flavor to it. And then sort of modernity comes around and it's sort of like, well, wait a second, we look for meaning in the world and we don't find it there. Therefore, meaning isn't objective. It's actually just purely subjective, right? Which is an idea that I think postmodernism takes even further in some of the ways that we're talking about. Just like, yeah, we all just live in our own story. There's a third answer to that, which is that meaning actually is real, but it's neither purely objective or subjective. It arises in this sort of dynamic transjective relationship between, an entity and its environment. John Vervaeke kind of talks
more about that, Brendan, because I find that fascinating. Because for part of my vantage point on this would be to say that, part of the modern shift was critiquing traditional metaphysics. And then as we move further away in the epistemological problem of how do I know anything at all, metaphysics seems to play less and less of a role in philosophy and practically in people's lives, where it's like we can ground this in phenomenology or other places, but whether that's sort of an agnosticism about metaphysical claims, where it's like, how could we ever know any of this at all, to a more postmodern distrust of metaphysical claims. So help me understand a little bit more when you're saying like, you're not satisfied from your vantage point. You're not satisfied with a sort of like Sisyphusian approach to just say, all right, I got to push this boulder up the mountain once again, but I can choose to make it valuable by just simply deciding in this internal state. Right. The gods can't control my internal state, so therefore I can decide that this is valuable. Are you saying you're not satisfied with that, and you feel there needs to be some other grounding beyond the self? And are you saying there's a search for that? Do you feel like both for you individually, but also within maybe the broader metamodern shift, are people kind of going back to metaphysics for that? What are they turning to find that maybe that grounding outside of the self? Yeah. No, and this I think is this is the thing that so many people are grappling with right now in a million different ways, right? And so, all right, so the danger, as I see it, would be that we do just sort of like become aware of all these dynamics around the modern turn and the postmodern turn, and then say, but we still need stories or something like that, and then just sort of kind of, we don't carry the ideas forward. We kind of just then conclude we have to sort of fall back on something, more kind of existentially primitive to how we were, enculturated or something like that, right? So I find that unsatisfactory. I also find sort of other approaches that do something very similar to be missing something really crucial. And so I guess I'll just say the way I look at it, and this is informed by folks I just mentioned, like John Vervaeke, and there's some great conversations between John and Greg Enriquez, who has a wonderful sort of meta theory, unifying theory of knowledge. People like Bobby Azarian, who are all operating in this metamodern space. I think that there's a shared solution space to these sorts of issues. And this is how I see it. It's something like there's an entity in a context, and in order for it to continue to exist, certain conditions need to be met, you could say. And those are real, right? Like, unless you want to be totally solipsistic or skeptical to some extreme degree and just deny the existence of, I don't know, anything, any kind of world or something, right? You'd have to admit that, like, no one, even the most ardent sort of relativistic postmodernist anti-realist, is going to step outside while it's raining and just say it's not raining. You know what I mean? Right, like that doesn't fly. So if it is raining, then you have to consider the fact of like, okay, well, this is going to make me cold and miserable, and probably I might get a cold or whatever. So you have to like do things in relationship to reality in order to continue to
successfully be an entity in the world, right?
So you're talking like emergence and emanation in some
Yeah,
sense,
well,
right?
certainly there's an emergent component to this, and the emergence emanation bit. Maybe I can come back to that and see if we could plug it into that kind of a framework. But the basic idea that I find really helpful can actually ground out in some things as fundamental as like information theory, thermodynamics, where you've got, okay, I am an informational entity. In order to continue to exist successfully, I need to be processing information about my environment, and I need to do that accurately. And if that information actually is helping me maintain my viability, then that information is meaningful to me, like full stop. Like that's just, someone can't be like, I'm just going to go walk off a cliff, and deny that it's like, nope, you won't be around anymore, right? So the knowledge of if I walk off this cliff, I will no longer be around, that's meaningful. And at a certain point, you just can't kind of deconstruct that anymore. You can't kind of, interpretively, hermeneutically work your way around, but it could mean this or it could mean that, right? Like there's to the degree that information about the environment affects the viability of the continued persistence of a thermodynamic entity in context, that's now what becomes really interesting about that, though, is that that's a very crude, simplistic notion of meaning. I mean, the kinds of meaning that we really mean when we talk about meaning are things about like, what's the meaning of my life and relationships and all this stuff, right? So you've got to get from this sort of very simplistic notion of meaning that you get from thermodynamics and information theory to the kinds of existential, philosophical, spiritual, religious meanings that we're talking about. And so then you have to appreciate that there's a complexification process between the two. And that's where things really start to get interesting, when you can situate yourself as the long end product of billions of years of complexification, where information and entities sort of have been in this continual dance leading to increasing information, increasing complexity of organisms, increasing complexity of the relationship between the two, so that meaning itself evolves and complexifies. And that's kind of the stuff I'm exploring at the moment, which again dovetails very much with a certain kind of strand of metamodern thought. But it's to ground this all back, this is the same, we're trying to resolve the same issue here, right? Which is like, how do we make meaning in this world that we supposedly have come to realize is fully deconstructible and totally constructed and whatnot. And
are we simply making it, or are we discovering it? I think that's an important question too, right?
Yeah, I think that a lot of what is coming out of the metamodern discourse space is taking these seeming binaries and then realizing the way that it's not either or, that there's always sort of this both and component to this. And so I think that once you have that in mind, you can look back and see how a lot of our going astray on a lot of these issues has come about because we absolutized a particular way of thinking about something, right? So like you go back and it's like, oh, something is true. And it's just true from the beginning of time. It has a priori, reality to it. And, there's some Platonic ideal that exists in this other world, right? And it's like, and then over time, that all gets sort of critiqued and deconstructed. But then you get the sort of Kantian thing of like, no, it's just the mind, right? And reality conforms to the mind. And then you get this radical relativism and this sort of like total, the potential for total social constructivism. It's just sort of whatever the mind thinks is real. And both of these are very extreme positions, right? It's sort of like, well, maybe both of these are going on simultaneously. Like maybe there are real things, but the mind needs to construct its ability to be able to understand and relate to them. And, there are frameworks for thinking in these terms, like Piaget's constructivism and the whole tradition of developmental psychology is like this continual equilibration between entity and field coming to learn each other more and more, so that it's both there's a reality and the mind constructs or participates in constructing its relationship to that reality. Both of those are true. We don't have to choose between them. So I think a lot of the metamodern conversation is like really trying to find those points of synthesis, which is often a synthesis between modern and postmodern extremes.
I see what you're talking about here, Brendan, is also having a point of connection to what maybe both modernism and postmodernism were doing, especially in American culture, with the elevation of the atomized individual, right? So if in modernism, the individual, well, we could take this all the way back to the Protestant Reformation, where Luther trusts his gut over and against the hierarchical institutions of the past, which were the place in which you did have access to the truth. That was the narrative, right?
Yeah.
And so the rejection of locating it through the hierarchical institutions and in the individual gets us obviously to Descartes. But then the postmodern impulse has been to not only critique, we're not just doing like Descartes, I think, therefore I am, but there's also the sense in which because all narratives are a play for power, that maybe, especially as this takes shape in American culture, that I can author my own narrative. I can radically self-author in a way that there is no necessarily external reality to which I have to conform to. The only thing I'm trying to conform to, and maybe even conform the world outside of me to actually match what I believe my internal state is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and you see this all the time with the way that language has become so important. We have to police language now because there's this thought that, oh, well, if we just change the words, we'll change reality. Like if someone doesn't have a word for something and we just obliterate that from our conceptions, then this will lead in, some miraculously better world. And so there is very much like that kind of, the way that we are tone policing and word policing and canceling each other and sort of not engaging with these ideas and sort of just cutting off conversation at that level is a direct outgrowth of a certain worldview, which says that we create reality. And so if we can change people's minds, then we'll change reality. And so obviously that is misguided and not entirely true, right? But there's a kernel of truth to it. Like we can change the way we speak about things, and maybe that would have a moderately better impact on society. So again, it's just this escape from either or thinking of like we have to choose one side of this polarity, when in fact what I see is very emblematic of all metamodern thought as sort of this continual moving between these different polarities. And this is a sense of what the word meta means, actually. Meta can mean between, and one of the ways that the original Dutch theorists used the term related directly to that is that the metamodern mind is always oscillating, is the word that they use, between sort of these postmodern views of things and these modern views of things. And for the record, too, I think also it's important for the context of this conversation, not just the modern. I mean, like, let's say other cultural logics it's oscillating between. On the one hand, it can kind of take that social constructivist angle, but then, when that starts getting too extreme and just sort of ridiculous in terms of where it falls apart with reality, then it can kind of reaffirm that, well, no, there is something here, right? But there's this back and forth that's sort of continually setting those different lenses in relationship to each other so that you're getting some dynamic third thing rather than just, one of these two extremes. So I think, you see that in all areas of sort of, this metamodern shift.
Do you think maybe, I'm just kind of spitballing here at the top of my head as we're talking, do you think there's any possibility that maybe what we have learned is, as we look at the kind of Hegelian, here's the synthesis, here's the antithesis, and we've seen as we've gone back that how strongly people have said the antithesis is the truth, up against the synthesis, that maybe what metamodernism is trying to do is trying to like predict in advance where the new synthesis is going to land. Maybe by doing that oscillation between the thesis and the antithesis. In this case, it would be the primary thesis and antithesis of modernism and metamodern or postmodernism, right? So modernism, and maybe even going before that, the traditional storytelling, traditional worldview, that you have that sort of thesis, postmodernism being the antithesis, and metamodernism obviously seeking to find the synthesis in advance, instead of just letting this collision maybe devolve into a total state of war and anarchy and complete disillusionment. Do you think there's any merit to that, that possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very helpful way of thinking about it, that it's becoming aware of the dialectical nature of this is at least the crucial part, right? If you are only able to conceive of opposite binaries, you're in a different position. If you're able to cognize, oh, I'm between a rock and a hard place, I'm between two opposite poles, and they might actually relate to one another, and they might actually maybe even sort of complement each other or have a kind of opponent processing factor that maybe, and once you're in that mindset, you're I think already, already made that move. And I think you're right. I mean, there's a anticipation factor of like, okay, well then what does it look like to sort of, bring together these seemingly opposite things. So anyway, that's a very helpful framing. There are all sorts of ways of framing it.
Right.
And I don't want to reify any particular one as this is the right metamodern, because there's these dynamics that are very deep, and we can represent them in different ways. Right. Modern or thesis, antithesis, synthesis is one way of doing that, but we can also do, more traditional Hegelian dialectics. We can talk about, basically things going meta on themselves, or I talk about eternal recursion, the sort of continual standing back and self-reflecting on what was before. But I think what they all gesture to, right, is that it's aware of the fact that we are presented with these contraries, and building that into the perspective itself, that like perspectives are often mediating what came before in terms of seeming opposites, and they need to, ideally bring these together and find where they can productively relate to one another.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can we circle back around, because when you're talking about, I think the desire to find meaning outside of the self in something, I don't want to go as far as to say objective truth, but to ground it in a, let's say using other philosophical language, the recognition that I am not necessary, but I am contingent, and I'm dependent on some other necessity beyond myself. I think that is part of the awareness that there are forces at play. And this is where, for me, I wanted to circle back around to what you're talking about, because it seems like this dance that Vervaeke has been talking about for quite some time between emergence and emanation, right? So emanation being kind of like the top down, the thing outside of ourselves that provides the constraints, the playground, if you will, for which we can conform and have that bottom up causality. But the bottom up causality isn't that, and I think this is really, I know this is going to sound for some of my listeners like we're getting too far into the philosophical weeds here, but I do think there are practical, existential, daily life stuff connected to this. That if we see ourselves as having nothing outside of ourselves to conform to, like there's no reality, there's no playground, there's no fence to inhabit, there's no space, there's no container to be poured into, that it creates what, again, like Vervaeke has called combinatorial explosion, which is part of our problem. Like we feel like we can, I don't know if you follow any of like, what's his name? Byung-Chul Han. And any of his work at all. Golly, I'm drawing a blank on his book titles. But he's talked about this shift into an achievement society, in which we feel the constant need to optimize ourselves. But the problem is that we have seemingly endless options for optimization. So there aren't constraints, and we feel like as part of our narrative, we can make ourselves whatever we want, but we don't know what good thing to make ourselves to. So there is the recognition of some sort of top-down constraint, top-down thing to adhere to. Yeah. Is that a fair way of maybe assessing what the metamodern impulse is, to find some proper container while still recognizing the critiques of postmodernism that I recognize? And I tell this to people, Brendan, like I'm a pastor. I recognize that if I was born in Somalia, the statistical likelihood of me being a Christian pastor is infinitesimally small. I recognize I was born into the story. I'm self-aware of the story, but I am also trying to be honest about, okay, given that I can't live without a story, I have to adhere to some structure, and I'm earnestly searching to allow myself to adhere to some structure that I see is true. I'm not trying to be blind to it. It seems like what I've noticed in our generation is like the tiredness, the exhaustion of nothing but cynicism, nothing but irony that isn't like leading to sincerity. And we have this new impulse that goes, all right, I'm still going to use my ironic language, but I am trying to find a container. Like I'm trying to find the top-down force that I should adhere to.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. This will get a little trippy, maybe, and maybe it'll
Let's
be a
do
little
it.
weird. All right,
Let's get trippy.
so I remember this episode of Boy Meets World, where
Yes, let's go there.
yeah,
Oh, one of my favorites.
yeah. Speaking of and all right, so in this episode, it's the older brother. I want to say his name is Will, but maybe that's the name of the actor. I forget the name of the older brother, but
Is it Eric?
Eric, yes, Eric. Corey's older brother goes off to Hollywood because he's like gotten into acting, and while he's there, he stars in a television sitcom pilot called "Kid Gets Acquainted with the Universe." All right, and on the set, right, it's all the same characters from Boy Meets World, but they have slightly different names, and he's playing a character named Derek or something, right? So it's this. So this is what you would call going meta, okay, and on some way, right? Now, when you watch this, you're like, this is a spoof, it's a joke, it's sort of like there's no way to, they're being cheekily self-aware, right? And they're breaking the fourth wall and all this stuff, and all these things have characteristic elements of postmodern art. You see this a lot in postmodern art of just being very hyper self-conscious. Where a book becomes about reading the book, right? That sort of a thing. Or like, the author is telling you that he's writing the current sentence that he's writing, right? These are all meta moves that you find in kind of classic postmodern works of art. And a lot of the kind of immediate takeaway from some of that stuff, right, is, oh, okay, yeah, all this stuff is kind of just silly, and it makes me very aware of this thing. It's sort of, I don't even have the illusion of suspension of disbelief. I'm just like, it's putting it all in my face. It's a construct. It's not real, all of that. And that can be sort of disenchanting and disillusioning and sort of, yeah, then you're kind of being ironic, okay? But now here's where I want to kind of get a little trippy with this. Then you kind of really go with it, and then you work with that move, because you do see it is a move. Like, that's what postmodern art is doing all the time in all sorts of things. The Simpsons have other television shows on that, like Dinosaurs or Family Guy, that they have send-ups of, because they're like, hey, wow, these guys are so much like us, right? It's sort of like, okay, we're going to do this meta move, right? So this is a move. But once you see that it's a move, you have a new enduring container, right? You have a new thing that exists. And so then you can say, oh, well, what is the nature of that container? Well, it's this recursive move that has a deep kind of structure to it, and it repeats itself and it reflects on itself. Now, once you have that, you're like, this is a real thing, right? I'm not just like, we've deconstructed something, but we've deconstructed it using a thing that is not deconstructed. It's a real mental move that you make it's the container for deconstruction. You see what I'm saying?
Yes,
so it's like you've gotten beyond deconstruction, meta deconstruction, because you're actually seeing the very container that deconstruction needs to even be able to do what it's doing. And once you're there, you can start to say, hey, there are things that exist outside the context of just infinite, cultural constructivist deconstruction. There are the containers in which these things happen. And that provides a new kind of solid ground to work with. But you have to go through it to get there. You have to deconstruct in order to get outside of the container. So what I posit is that this postmodern moment is very much where we're still stuck in the deconstructing move. We haven't kept going. We haven't gotten beyond it. And so we're stuck with the disenchantment and the disillusionment and the cynicism and the irony. But if you keep going, then that very stuff is what allows you to find a new kind of meta level container. So that would be a way of beginning to think about the sorts of moves that go into these sorts of things. And I can say more about meaning as sort of a similar move, but that would just be one way of framing it.
Okay. So then, if metamodernism is trying to find the container that holds the deconstruction,
yeah,
is that a fair way of summarizing that in some sense?
I think, as I say, right, all metamodernisms or the metamodern quintessentially is about going beyond postmodernism by means of postmodernism. So whatever you're going to find on the other side is going to be somehow a meaningful product of postmodernism, but it's going to also transcend it as well. And so this is a classic example of how that would work, because you have to go through the deconstruction process to then find the new stable structure. I wouldn't go so far as to say that all forms of metamodernism are somehow about trying to do this.
Yeah.
I think that this is and this is the case I'm making in my book, because to talk about a cultural logic of cultural logics is kind of where you get to on the other side of this stuff, is that you see that, there's a structure to how cultural logics themselves evolve, right? So metamodernism is also about this move, in the sense that it's aware of how this process unfolds. So it's able to see that, postmodernism is actually a necessary step in this process, because it's key to how this whole thing operates. But then you're able to contextualize that, and you're able to relativize relativism. You're able to be skeptical of skepticism, and you're able to deconstruct deconstruction, because you put it in a wider frame. So that to me seems to be like a really necessary, way of thinking about all this. And when I synthesized all the different ways people were talking about metamodernism, that is sort of the underlying structure to all these different kinds of discourse, seems to be this basic move. So that is the basic idea. And I think what I would say, though, I want to tie this into the meaning issue, which I think would be valuable, but I also recognize that there's a lot to all this. So I don't know if we want to, get a little bit sure first.
Yeah, no, I'd like to talk about that. The only other pressing question I have, Brendan, and you can pick which one you'd like to address first, is thinking about what sorts of implications that this getting at the core of cores, the container of containers, what this shift, this impulse, what kind of impact it has on like traditional religion in America.
Yeah.
Because I've wondered how much of the shift towards a little autobiographical, and then you can choose which way you want to take this. So I think back to my parents who were, my dad was raised kind of nominally Catholic. My mom was raised devoutly Catholic. They saw that in some sense as the thesis, with all of the flaws that they perceived in that thesis. And then when they got into their early adult years, they chose this kind of new thing at the time, which was this born again Billy Graham evangelical experience, very personal. So we're going to move away from, at the time there were already shifts happening because it's post Vatican II, from Latin Mass, but they want to hear the Bible in their native tongue. And they want to read Bible translations that sound like their cultural context. And the music that's going to happen in church isn't organs and from the medieval times. There's not doing the smells and bells. We're not doing that stuff. We actually want to communicate with the cultural vocabulary of our day. And so they very much grew up in that. I'm a product of that, but I see a lot of people that their parents went through that sort of change, and then they grow up, and then they go to like Eastern Orthodoxy or Catholicism or, the more high church liturgical expressions. Now, there's a lot of different ways we could frame that, but I'm really wondering how much of that, is that simply kind of, you can kind of see these recurring patterns throughout time of people going, hey, I came from this and I want to go back to something before that. Is that metamodern? What sorts of impacts do you see as these stories disseminate in through popular culture, as the aesthetic changes, and those aesthetic changes begin to impact not just guys like you and me who are reading this stuff, and not to pat ourselves on the back, but we're not normal when it comes to like picking up on these trends. I would like to think that I'll speak of you, that you're very much on the front end of this bleeding edge, and this I don't think if you asked your average person on the streets like what metamodernism is, they'd be like, I have no idea. So as that moves more into the mainstream and moves into the broader culture, what sorts of impacts do you see it having on traditional religion? And feel free, if you feel like that connects to what you want to say about the
Yeah, yeah.
pursuit of meaning?
No, it's
I'm
good.
sure there is something there.
Yeah. No, I'll tackle that one. And it's so interesting too, because you describe that whole thing you described. I have direct experience with that as well. My parents basically had that experience, grew up in, mainline churches, found the evangelical thing because it was the antithesis to the thesis. And I was that next generation that was very fascinated by Eastern Orthodox Christianity. One thing I'll say is, they say that every problem looks like a nail to a hammer, right? So I'm a metamodern thinker. So there's a danger of trying to interpret all these sorts of patterns in culture as somehow, whatever. And I don't want to, I don't want to over.
Hammer away, Brendan. This is what I called you here for.
But I want to avoid the trap of of doing that. I will say though, there's an interesting way, right, about how, like, the attraction, say, to Eastern Orthodoxy after coming from an evangelical context is different than if you made the reverse move. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's because, right, like, I do think that there's this metamodern aspect here in which there's a deep pragmatism as well that I think informs a lot of metamodern thought, which it stems from the same insight, right? Of like, well, we got to live with some story, right? So it's sort of like a pragmatic realization that are between a rock and a hard place, and you just got to choose because you got to get on with your life and you have to have some meaning in it. So there is a pragmatism there. And I think that there is a kind of attraction to certain kinds of religiosity from the standpoint of, damn it, I want to be religious, and it's almost like, I don't want to say it's as flippant as, flip a coin literally, but there's some sense of like, I need this element in my life and I want to choose this and I'm attracted to these aesthetics, right? And so I will engage with this thing because it gives me this value. But that's a very reflective stance to like adopt a religious tradition for. It's very different if you were to grow up in the tradition itself and just like get the experience of this is the truth and this is the way that reality is. You'd have to deconstruct that before you'd even be able to get in the position where you could authentically, agentially, volitionally choose the thing that you're in. And oftentimes, to be fair, a lot of the places that we're coming from, we're often trying so hard to distance ourselves from that it's going to be very unlikely that we're going to end back in the place once we've done all that work that we have done so much to get away from. Though some people do. And I could very well conceive of a situation where people leave, or let's say that people find that people find a form of the religiosity that I left and affirm it from a metamodern standpoint for all the reasons that we're talking about. But you have to see, and the point I'm making is that they're different then, right? That it's a different, and a lot of it has to do with the degree of reflection, which is, again, the sort of recursive reflection and this reflective move that we're always doing with things. It's sort of, we're learning from them. We're able to take them as an object of analysis. We're able to, not just look through our glasses, but look at our glasses and then go from that vantage, right? So I think a lot of, the move here is when you grow up, when you're enculturated, and when you're learning things, like your whole formative period of life for the first, say, 20 years, a lot of it is just being taught how to see through a certain pair of glasses, right? And then in time, you might very well come to realize that way of seeing isn't complete, that it is a pair of glasses that you can take off and analyze. And then you do that for a while. And maybe that occupies a lot of your, early 20s and whatever. But then eventually you're like, okay, yep, that's how this whole thing works. And, now it's like, which pair of glasses am I going to wear and why?
That's right. Because you can't go without that lens.
Yeah.
There's always the interpretive lens. So the awareness of that to me seems like a differentiating factor between just like, I'm leaving this thing because I'm upset or I'm hurt for valid reasons or non-valid reasons, whatever the case may be, and I'm running away from this thing. That seems very different than going, oh, I've taken off my glasses. I realize I have an interpretive lens. Mm-hmm. And then you go and you take that one set off and then you put on another pair and then you realize, oh, shoot, wait, this is also has these filters.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Now, this is where things start to become very interesting as well, though, because, all right, a couple things here. Let's say I have some rose-colored glasses on, right? And I'm like, yes, the world is so rosy. Now, of course, I wouldn't say that because everything is rosy, so it's all contextually viewed through that lens, right? But then someone comes around and they tell me, hey, actually, you're just viewing through a pair of rose-colored glasses. And to the degree that I don't just immediately shoo them away because they're challenging my sense of reality and get very defensive about that and actually take it seriously, then I might go through the whole thing of like learning to take them off, look at them, find another pair over here, and this has a green lens, and then try those on, right? And I think that, I guess one of the things I want to say is, one, that movement, I think, is the movement from sort of naive traditionalism or naive religiosity into a sort of modern critical stance where we're able to take religion itself as a subject, as an object of criticism and study. And so that would be starting to do this, right? And then the postmoderns come along and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, but here's all these other glasses you could choose from. And so it's all relative, right? It's all totally random, right? Now, here's where the thing really starts to click, I think, is that then once you take that seriously, you're like, wow, there are all these different kinds of glasses I could be wearing. And then you say, I can put them all on and I can compare them. I can put them all on and adjudicate between them. Some of them are showing aspects better than others, maybe some prescriptions closer to my eyes or whatever. There are certain aspects in which I'm getting new elements of what is there through different kinds of glasses. But even bigger than that, one becomes aware of this whole meta move, that it's the case that we're all wearing glasses. We can all become aware of it. We can all take them off, study them, and then see the ways in which we're wearing various forms of glasses. And that then becomes, you could say, a new set of glasses that seems like it's absolute, that you're looking through the world through the lens of lenses, right? You've got a cultural logic of cultural logics, because that's what this is. It's sort of like, what are these different lenses? Well, there are different religions, there are different ideologies, but more than that, there are different sort of degrees of perspectival awareness, you could even say. And so you start to see that what all of these things have in common is that it's better to have more knowledge of more glasses and to be able to go through the process itself of adjudicating that. And that there's something that feels closer to like truth about that whole meta process, right? And so you're able, because
that would allow you allow you to have some sort of comparison. If you say, as I've tried on 12 different sets of glasses, I notice some similar features shared. Right. Maybe that's pointing to some, core of cores here that actually is revealing something that is true across these perspectives.
Right. There's not only the fact that you can then compare perspectives and see what they have in common and then be in a better position to say, well, that's real. And I think to some degree, modernism is already kind of engaged in projects like that. But I think what's even the bigger move is seeing that there's this meta pattern of lens analysis. You know what I mean? That the whole thing itself provides a way to adjudicate between perspectives. And because, right, when you put on a pair of glasses and you can't see that people are wearing glasses, those glasses aren't telling you as much about reality as a pair of glasses where you put them on and you do see that, right? This is where the analogy falls apart a little bit because glasses can't do all this, but you understand what I'm saying, right? That there's something intrinsically valuable about the art of deconstructing a worldview in a perspective in order to then see beyond it, and then to get to the meta perspective of seeing the process of worldview construction and deconstruction itself, which then provides you some solid thing that you can compare all worlds to, if that makes sense. So that gives you this meta pattern that's sort of a new rubric or a new measure or universal scale or something, right? And this is what I mean when I talk about meaning and the complexification of meaning and all this stuff, because this is something quite different than, we all just live in a story, so we might as well choose one, which is still very inflected by postmodern relativism, to, well, we've gone through postmodern relativism, and now we're able to relativize it within a broader process that is sort of a still actually universal process. Now, hopefully, one, people are with me on any of this and it's making sense. Two, I want to qualify that as well, because I don't immediately, once you see that this is this process, you see that it keeps going, right? There's no clear end to this process. It has a kind of self-transcending quality to it. And so there should be some epistemic humility that we have here, that even though we have this sort of universal scale of like, well, how many perspectives can we see, and that's real, and that's not just, whatever you want to believe. We also shouldn't say that even this whole perspective won't be transcended in some other meta level where we put on a new set of glasses. And I can understand how that might make people uncomfortable, because it seems like the solid ground that we just got from this sort of thing is now immediately then torn out from under us. But I also want to invite people to think about this as a mystery, as the mystery of reality, that I think personally I see as a sacred process. And when I start marrying this idea of how the development of knowledge works and the connection with reality to certain forms of apophatic, mysticism, there's fascinating connections there to be made in terms of like an eternally disclosing world, a reality that is becoming more and more clearly known by people, even as it's also always receding away in this ultimate mystery, which I think is, if you're a believing person, shouldn't be any great discomfort either. There is sort of this. And so this is what I want to tie back into the emanation bit, So what I'm talking about is emergence. Every time you take off the glass and come to this whole new conception of reality, you've like gone through an emergent phase shift, and you're seeing things in like a totally different way. Things have your knowledge has been restructured and reorganized, and you've got a new, that's emergence. That's bottom up kind of transcendence. But there is this thing that's sort of on the other end of this whole process that we're moving towards in doing that. And that's the emanation bit. And that's a lot harder to speak about, right? And that's where I want to locate that emanation aspect. And you can call that God. You can use, the imagery of the Bible to talk about it. And you can, and I think we should draw on the experience of the mystics and the mystical literature, especially in the Christian tradition, to think about this. But I think that's the mystery of it to me. And I think where this stops being a purely sort of cultural analysis or kind of epistemological speculation and starts to become a kind of devotional relationship to the ground of being and the infinitely self-emanating abundance of the fullness of the one, or something like that.
Yeah. So with that mystery, there's maybe a couple different existential responses to that, to the confession of the ultimate transcendence of the ground of being, right? That there is, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, you're more apt to use the apophatic language of what God is not than what He is, so that you don't constrain the possibilities of the transcendent. And yet, there's a real problem there with combinatorial explosion, with decision fatigue, and a sense of decision paralysis, where you can get to the point where the mystery becomes so grand that you don't know where to take a first step. And I think that would be a concerning feature of, okay, so the metamodern shift, if you accept some of these presuppositions, if you accept where, what's the word I'm looking for? If you accept where because it's not even just, I don't want to reduce this to like, here's propositional knowledge about the world, because it's very much connected to, when you watch these core videos, for example, it's not propositional, it's aesthetic.
A vibe. Yeah.
It's a vibe. Yeah. So where's the vibe? Where's the vibe leading you? I'm very optimistic about the possibility that in this moment, people are very open to positive reconstruction. That for me is like a win, but I'm also confessing my convictional location on this as somewhat of a Kierkegaardian Christian, in that I'm like, yes, there's something at the edge of this dock, and this is maybe to use another metaphor or picture, that we can, let's say, take the reasons for believing that there is something positive to reconstruct into, that there is a core of cores, that there's a container of containers.
No, I think I know where you're getting at. So, well, and I don't want to interrupt you though, so please finish your thought. But I think I know.
So let me throw this out there then to you, Brendan. Then you can please provide your feedback and comments on it. But for me, the way I picture it is this sense that there is enough general revelation, to use my Christian theological language, to lead me to, as like what Paul would argue in Romans 1, that God's invisible attributes are on display within the material world that's been created. And there's enough reason to believe that there is a core of cores, there's a container of containers, there is, and you could go through all the Aristotelian, the five reasons of Augustine or not Augustine, of Aquinas and Aristotle for believing in all of that stuff, but it still leads you to this point of which rationality is not enough, that you have to enter into the supra rational.
Yeah.
And this for me is, as again, kind of a Kierkegaard disciple, this is where that leap of faith from the edge of the dock into the ocean that stands in front of you is the only way that you can know whether or not you will swim. Is when you actually move from, here are the propositions that I've been built upon, and now I have to actually like give of myself. And so for like Kierkegaard, this is the only way that one actually truly comes to know Christ, to know God, is in that decisive leap of faith, the actual movement. So I think you're probably tracking with me on this, Brendan. The question then for some that come out of this and they go, I want to reconstruct, I want to positively reconstruct, where do I take the leap? Is there a leap? With that leap also comes the risk. I don't want to leap into the wrong thing. I still have to hold to what we've learned from postmodernism, that maybe that story I'm leaping into is just simply masking a play for power. I think the one for me, Brendan, I have no problem talking about this. This is me confessing that I know I'm situated in a story. Is like, the Nietzschean critique that this is nothing more than slave morality. It's a poignant critique. That this story is a great story if you want to remain on the underside and the bottom side of history all the time. And so to encourage people in my vocation to take that leap, I take it very, very seriously, So mystery, the searching for the core of cores, the meta beyond the meta. How do we move beyond the sense of paralysis and decision fatigue into actually stepping into something that we could positively reconstruct, name that we're positively reconstructing, or are we just kind of stuck with our same old epistemology problems?
I think there's a couple of related questions in there, and I'll tackle one first, and it might answer all of them. I'm not sure, but I actually love this image of the core of cores. So we'll take that in a very sincerely ironic way and like really run with it. Okay, so like imagine a mandala, right? It's sort of a series of concentric circles, right? And when you think about that structure, you can see that it's sort of like you can also think of it in sort of a Venn diagram way, that like, what's at the center is sort of in all of the things, right? Now, if you think about this complexification thing I've been talking about, and which relates directly, by the way, to being able to see more and more perspectives and more lenses, that you see that the complexification of meaning gets us to these places. And so we're taking in more and more perspectives. But then the question is, what's the core of cores? If there were a core of cores, then we would have good cause to, let's say, always be able to rest in something. I want to come back and qualify this in a second, but what I want to suggest is love. It's not, I don't think of this so much as a leap of faith, which for me still rings with all this propositional logic and maybe even some kind of relational, interpersonal logic or something. But love is the vibe. Love is the vibe. And what I mean by that is that it's true at all levels, right? That there's no point where you can get to the complexification of something, or you get to a new perspective and all of a sudden you're totally justified to be an asshole. Doesn't work that way. There's like, you can go down to the most, simple or pure or whatever kind of, language you want to use for this kind of even very naive faiths, and you'll find agape and eros and other kinds of love, philos, but you'll find this sense of connection, of harmony, of moving, of wanting to bring together and to unite. And, then you can start getting into theologies of love and everything, which Kierkegaard did too. But you can also then zoom out, right? And you can also see that there's this operates too at like, these levels that we're talking about of metamodern self-reflexive recursivity and all this stuff. But it's like, we're still engaged in a connection that is not lost or torn asunder by the complexification of it all, and that actually, as you're able to see more and more of reality and see more and more perspectives and more of the truth, and as that reality discloses itself to you and you have more pieces and parts to work with, the love is what is binding all those pieces together, so that you're seeing just more and more of the way that love, as Dante would say, causes the planets to dance around the stars. So that would be my initial answer, is that the vibe is love and the core of cores is love. And that you can think about that as being the thing that binds all those together. Now, fascinating, or maybe bizarre as it may sound, this was something I got from synthesizing metamodernisms. At least, a pattern I was picking up in a lot of people talking about this. You've got Alexander Dumitrescu talking about, this sort of kindness and Jacob's ladder. You've got Vermeulen and von Daniker talking about eros and sort of the metaxy, binding the different finite and infinite. You've got, the Hansi Freinacht stuff and the whole complexity aspect of this, really kind of filling in this neo-Aristotelian leveled ontology, and connecting that to psychology in the ways that this sort of complexification leads to increasing degrees of embrace, I guess is what Susan Cook-Reuter would call it, but the increasing levels of intimacy and connection with other people, and that becomes sort of the telos. You could say that, like, whatever that is simultaneously the core of cores, but it's also that emanating reality that's sort of unfolding more and more of itself, and that somehow in the great, paradoxical vision of the mystics, the center is also their circumference, and the origin is also the destination. So that would be kind of a metamodern mystical response to that question, which I think begins more immediately from like a practical concern of like, how then,
Yes.
how then shall we live our lives, sort of a thing. So the first answer, I think, is just sort of like, well, and this is the end, or one of the great takeaways of that metamodern film I mentioned, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is be kind. Be kind, especially when you don't know what's going on. And we don't know what's going on. And we can expect that we should always have our lenses ripped from our faces and we see a whole new level of reality, and that our senses of ego and worldview get deconstructed and we've got to rebuild. There's always so much that we don't know, and this profound uncertainty and the chaos that's beyond our minimal complexity to be able to make sense of. So that's always going to be the case, but there's always this enduring sense of be kind. And if you can start there, then you're probably doing the most important thing. And then we can, talk about whether any of the other stuff makes any sense.
Yeah, that's beautifully stated. That does remind me of what Aquinas argued, that caritas was the highest virtue, that there was some superlative virtue up above all of them. And I do think at the end, maybe this is kind of still kind of like an existentialist wager here, that I've always looked at that, Brendan, and gone, all right, what would be the worst? And maybe this is some sort of like Pascal's wager sort of deal here, but what would be the worst that would come of my life if I actually gave myself in love to seeking the good of the other when I encounter them? And if I made that, and if I actually trusted that at the core of cores, that was the thing that brought everything to be, was a desire to connect, a desire for communion. And at the very center of it was loving communion. I mean, there's certainly, I'm not saying Christianity is the only story that has that, but I do look at that and go, these are the sorts of things that for me, Brendan, I go, all right, I'm very aware that I'm in a story, but this one, at least on those levels, it matches up for me, right? And if at the end I end up being wrong, I think I don't think I would have as many regrets as if I rejected that premise. I rejected the way of love. I rejected seeking the good of the other. If I rejected that and pursued my own selfish ends, I think I've been bedside for people who, pardon me, in those dying moments of life, and have been bedside with people that have given themselves to that. And if in the end it's just all, you head into the void, and that what was it in Everything Everywhere All at Once, the the
The
everything
everything
bagel of,
Yeah.
yeah, the everything bagel of nothingness, if that
Yeah.
just consumes us all in the end. I know there's a point in which, the Apostle Paul argued, if there is no resurrection, then, we are to be pitied among all people. And I'm pretty much an idiot for giving my life to this, but I still think there's probably something of a Pascalian wager that not the way it's often used in
Yeah.
cliches, but the sense that what you're talking about, I don't know, but I know the difference in my life when I've given myself to my ego versus giving myself to truly seeking the good of my neighbor, those around me, of loving God and loving other people, and believing that at the very core of cores that there is, Stanley Grentz's book, Theology for the Community of God. This is his argument that, one of the distinctions for the Christian story is the story of, at the very core of cores, you have a communion within a Godhead. And I'm not asking, you to agree with that, or listeners to agree with that sentiment. But for me, I find that picture compelling, that there is loving communion at the center in which we are being enveloped into. If in the end I'm wrong, I don't know. What's the worst that could come of me, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, yes, for me, the Kierkegaardian leap was really a crucial transition moment in my life, for getting out of nihilism, let's say. And I think that leap, Kierkegaard had a stage model, right, of faith, basically, of the religious life, and it begins in aestheticism, and goes into the ethical realm and then into religiosity. So he was using a stage model, and I think I think that there's something about what he's talking about that actually does fit into like a certain stage approach to the religious life. I think for me, where it resonates most, though, is it's what you do when you're in the bottom of the abyss of nihilism. That to me is where you make the Kierkegaardian move. And one of the things that I find interesting about that, though, is part of what happens with those stage transitions is that by the time they've sort of played themselves out and there's like a seed there that then grows into something, and the thing it grows into is very different than the thing it was, if that makes any sense. And so totally. I think that while that leap of faith move is crucial, I think that, at least in my experience, it was doing that in that moment that then got me in a place where I could sort of climb out of the abyss and then look back and be like, oh man, I used to be down in that abyss. Right. But I would never have been able to do that had I not made that leap of faith. And so in that new leap of faith, it was a genuine moment of actual nihilism, really, because, and this is another interesting way in which, logics in a kind of Hegelian way negate their own negation and then turn into different things, right? Because nihilism itself gets you to a point where you can then affirm anything, including faith. You can become so meaningless in your life that you can then just choose meaning. And it's fascinating that if you actually do that and play that out, you can get out of that abyss, look down and be like, oh yeah, I used to believe in no meaning. That's wild. But you got there because you made a ladder for yourself and you climbed on top of yourself to get out. Or, someone could say you were climbing on top of more than that. So yeah, I guess the point I want to make is that I think that what you're describing is very real and important, but I think I want to encourage people too, that, I think that there's also something beyond the leap of faith, that it's like you're leaping, you can, let's say, land somewhere that might not be an eternal landing place, because again, in this sort of endlessly shifting sands, right, that they do keep changing, but you do land somewhere, and that the leap in retrospect becomes something different from that vantage than what it was when it was initiated. And so, yeah, I guess I wanted to make that point.
Yes, that's great. I'm glad you bring that up, Brendan, because that there would be some confusion there for some that might think, and maybe this is part of what we're processing in the metamodern age, is the answer simply to go back, right? To go back, like re-enchantment. Is re-enchantment simply going back? Do we just need to somehow get back to the medieval worldview and mindset? And like, no, there's a reason why we had to come out of that. Right. And this isn't to fall for the trap of, well, we're the inevitability of progress. I'm not suggesting that, but there is, even within, for me, the Kierkegaardian model, and for me, within the Christian story, there has to be a recognition of their perpetual transcendent nature of God. And so you have these signposts, and you can't settle for the signpost lest they become the idol.
Yes.
Right? So
Yes.
you move beyond that.
Yeah.
And there's a constant moving beyond, but it's not a moving beyond that should lead you to feel like I could never take a first step. And I think that's the thing I'm trying to like work through and help people work through, is like the first step out of the pit, out of the abyss.
Yeah.
And I think that's where like John has been really, really helpful. I haven't been, I want to word this carefully. I have my disagreements with, kind of Peterson's, maybe post-Daily Wire kind of turn. But I think Peterson's greatest strength was at least helping people go, take the first step out of the abyss.
Yeah.
Like there's an abyss there.
Yeah.
Like make a movement, that is a kind of, that's Camus. That is kind of the existentialist impulse, like radically rebel against the abyss in some way.
Yeah. And I think, this might be, hopefully I've somewhat ingratiated myself, but here's where maybe I become very challenging as well, because like part of me sees the process itself as destroying our idols, which means sometimes, no, I'm not going to say sometimes, it means destroying various forms of Christianity, maybe very, very precious forms, those earlier enculturated forms that we grew up with, that was our place where we had a firm foundation. Right. For me, the spiritual life and spiritual development is about being able to grapple with having your whole religious worldview crumble and then, get out of that abyss onto a new place. But then also accept that, like, it's not like, okay, now I'm safe. Right. It's that if we really accept the eternally kind of self-transcending aspect of the divine, then we have to take seriously that every solid ground is going to be, liable for deconstruction, basically. And I guess I'd want to invite people to see that process not as an inhibition towards growth or faith or any of that. It's just, that's the faith journey. It's like you get closer to God, I think, by continually killing God, if I can be so violent about it. But the whole death of God notion that Nietzsche presents us is, in a postmodern moment, lands as this abyss of nihilism. But when you see that it's actually the recursive movement of the killing of God that actually is what teaches you that there is a God beyond God, there is a God beyond every single idol that you set up. And I highly recommend the work of Jean-Luc Marion, who was very helpful for me on this bit, of God without being, which again puts us into a new area of sort of apophatic mysticism. He draws a lot on Pseudo-Dionysius, but the whole notion is that we have these conceptual idols, and that we need to really take seriously the idea that every single notion. Do I want to say that? I think so. I'll be absolutistic for a second. Every single notion that we have of God is wrong, and that we should be okay with that. That this is the upside of deconstruction, right? And I want to obviously qualify that with some of the things I was saying about the core of cores, and that there's love, and so I'm not trying to say that like we can all find out that God's this evil monster or something, right? That's not my point. My point is that if we are using images and symbols and myths and stories and worldviews as our story that we are affirming, great. But then we know that we're using the story, and then also be open to when the cracks show up in that story, that we can push that story over and transcend to some new thing. And that's going to be a storyless moment for a while. It's going to be falling through a vertiginous space of nihilism, potentially, or confusion, disorientation. But that is part of the recursive process of reflection, and that in the process, we're getting closer to that emanating truth of reality, not farther away from it. So that I would throw that out there. And it's a very, it might seem, I don't know, bleak or something. And maybe it is, but there's an element to which, if we really take seriously the sublimity and the grandeur of ultimate, divinity, then we should be epistemically humbled to see that pretty much everything that we're using to kind of gesture towards that is the crudest of of representations, and ultimately they are representations, and therefore they're ultimately idols. So there's a metamodern notion from I'll just say this last thing.
Yeah.
So Hansi Freinacht is a metamodern thinker. He talks about the image of the headless God as sort of his icon for the divine, because it's that God that can continually have its head chopped off, so to speak, that can keep coming back. That is really what deserves our awe and reverence. So I hope people get a sense of how what seems like the end of faith and religion and just this total consummation of a nihilistic postmodernism can be worked through in a way that recursively reaffirms itself to a point that you can see that there's a deep structure of meaning under all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe I'll throw out a couple maybe different words, and maybe we're in agreement, maybe we're in disagreement on that. Sure. And it's totally fine to be in disagreement on it as well. Maybe instead
You're saying there are different perspectives? What are you talking about? No,
sorry, I would maybe frame it as like our pictures are incomplete instead of all idolatrous. I think for me, would be at the core of idolatry is settling for the image as the final.
Yeah.
Right. And so where it becomes idolatry is not in the announcement of it being true, good, or beautiful, but in the finality of that particular picture, which is, I do think, like at the core of, the Hebrew tradition, which is really fascinating. Why the prohibition of making images of God is so fascinating, given the cultural context. Now you could say, well, they still made the Ark of the Covenant and things like that, but still there were very, very strong prohibitions on trying to come up with a particular like idol that would represent God in the same way that you might see across other cultures. And I think there's something to that. And yet I think I don't know if I'd say pushback, or maybe it's a qualification or a point of point of seeing if we're on the same page in this or not, is to say, okay, but I also don't want to do the move where I have to be the all of history begins afresh with me, and so I'm starting without any received tradition, without any sense in which, yes, affirming the transcendence of God, but also affirming the immanence of God. So God has wanted to make himself, at the nature of love would be some desire of intelligibility. To me, this grounds all of our scientific endeavors, right? Is that the world is to some degree or another intelligible because it's given to us as a gift. And with that, there are images that may still need to be corrected. But I think I bring this up because I think as a practical point, I know a lot of people have personally found some sense of transformation and actually revisiting old practices from their past that they maybe thought there was no value to. I think of even something simple as the practice of someone revisiting an old song. So quick story, and I want to respect your time too, Brendan, so we won't take too much longer here. But there's a guy at our church who several weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago, came up to me and he's like, I really appreciate the songs that we sung together because they brought me back to this moment. And he was a guy that was a Vietnam vet, and he showed up at a Billy Graham crusade one time because the girl that he was interested in was going to the Billy Graham crusade. And he spent the whole time at the Billy Graham crusade mocking it until finally the infamous Billy Graham altar call happened. And for some reason, he tells the story. He's like, I was making fun of the whole experience the whole time. All I was there was just try to get with this girl. And at the very end, I found myself compelled for something beyond me to run to the altar. And my entire life changed in that moment. And when I hear these songs, they bring me back to that moment of transformation. I would be reluctant to say that the journey of perpetual transformation would require that we have to disassemble all of those experiences down to the studs. And it doesn't seem like that'd be what you're saying. Is instead maybe like maintaining a posture of epistemic humility to there being limitations to them. Because otherwise, I don't know how we would get beyond the point of and then there's this dance here. To get to a journey requires a belief that there is some place to go to, but it also requires the knowledge that you have accumulated for how to use particular skills and resources to even make a movement in a particular direction.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the tension like I experience in this, because I do see a lot of people that, especially in our generation and younger, who might say, okay, I recognize that all of these stories and all these images of God are always going to be broken. So one of my choices here is I will never plug into any sort of traditional religious community, because everything that came from the past is ultimately going to lead me. And what I often see, just as a practical point, is a lot of people get involved into the kind of like DIY spiritualities, in which they're continually functioning as like, I'm the self-author. And then we're kind of like back at that same sort of point of the atomized individual who now allows and then they get involved in some sort of weird cult where you think the sex scandals that go through churches are bad. Wait till you get involved in some of these like guru sex cults. So yeah, that's just kind of like the back and forth I'm experiencing, the tension about right, the images of God and the idolatry that can come with them, but also recognizing like I don't have to start from scratch. There's received and inherited wisdom that we are actually referring to these people who we say they've got some glimpse of it, and that gives us a vantage point to stand on and gives us some sort of it gives us a house to live in, as opposed to constantly feeling like we're always remodeling all the time.
Gosh, I mean, this could be, you just outlined some such important things, and I feel like this could be the beginning of a whole new conversation, or not a new one, but there's at least an hour and a half to talk about this. But briefly, I mean, to tackle some of that. Yes, I get that. I think that I probably do skew a bit towards the how do I put it? I mean, yes, you're identifying something in what I'm saying, which is true, which is this, there's this recursive deconstruction process. And I think what you're saying is like, yeah, but like we have to live somewhere, and like, can't we eventually kind of, like be okay with where we're at and all that? And I want to honor that.
And beyond that, Brandon, I'll just throw this one other point is like, especially when we think about raising children, grandchildren. Then what do we pass on? Not just individually, but how do we help our kids enter into a story that we actually think leads to their good and their flourishing?
Yeah, 100%.
And I don't want to see my kids go through like perpetual deconstruction. I don't I want them to come face to face with idols that are unhealthy, that are leading to disorder, to ruin in their lives and the lives of other people. But I wouldn't, the things that I've gone through, I wouldn't wish on my children.
Yeah, I know, but it's also like, you're a great guy. So like, maybe you had to go through some of that, you know what I mean? Like, honestly though, it's like, I've had this conversation broached this conversation a couple of times with people in terms of like, this is partly the issue of suffering, right? I mean, the idea that your kids experiencing suffering is suffering. But at the same time, like, puberty sucks, man. You know what I mean? And like growing up is hard. And so there has got to be some allowance for like, but I think what you're also naming though is something really important, which is that, our whatever let's say you use the word images, I guess, because idols can be very loaded. And I do want to collapse a little bit some of this hard distinction between idol and image, right? Because it's like, I think we should also be okay with the fact that we're not getting the absolute, right? We might be selling, it's like we're, the perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good sort of a thing, right? It doesn't mean that like, just because we can't continually bask before the eternal face of God in the Empyrean doesn't mean that like we, should just give up on the whole religion thing. So, but what I was going to say was that I think you're naming a really important dynamic, which is the notion of development, that what role development plays in all of this. And by development, I mean psychological development. I mean, the journey that we make from being an infant to a young child, to an adolescent, to an adult, and then to a mature adult, et cetera. Like that's an arc. And that faith is going to look different. Religion is going to look different. Our God concepts are going to look different along that journey. And for this, I mean, James Fowler has done great work. There's excellent work on this topic that I think people should be taking very seriously. And all this ties directly into actually to what I was talking earlier about successively decentering acknowledging perspectives, because it's the same mechanism that allows our God concept to evolve and change and grow. So I want to name all that. And I also want to name that different people are going to sort of, settle in a particular spot on their developmental journey in different places than others, right? And not everyone's going to be called to a life of mysticism. Not everyone wants to be a desert hermit. Whether or not desert hermitage is even, an ideal is a different topic. But like, let's just say the religion has always appreciated the fact that like different people are on that journey and doing different aspects of it and following it to different degrees. There's esoteric and esoteric elements to this and all that. People have even challenged me, like, is apophatic mysticism a legitimate basis for religiosity? Like, how do you cohere a bunch of people around an absent center? I mean, I think you make a compelling connection to the idea of, aniconism in the Hebrew tradition that literally did just that. So I think there are models for it. So I want to say all that. I also want to say that that I do think that there can be very healthy expressions of DIY religion. And I have a whole way of thinking about this, which, again, goes into different terrains. But I see God as continuing to evolve, and that might be maybe a kind of strange or even heretical idea to some folks. But if you really do take everything that we've been saying seriously about this, unfolding disclosure, you could even call it unfolding revelation, then of course our concept of God keeps changing and evolving. And indeed, when you look back in history, you see that the notions of God do change and evolve, and that they do move from, more kind of mythological versions to more kind of moral, philosophical visions to sort of transcendent, and then into, and interestingly, those pair very, very fascinatingly with the kinds of developmental trajectories that we see at the individual level too. So, but again, different story. So what I'm saying is that it might be very serious that some people feel like they are called to sort of push into new terrain and, in an almost prophetic calling, try to speak new elements and new aspects of the divine into the world. And that there are interesting and important ways that kind of work can be done seriously and not just sort of a new age DIY buffet style pick and choose approach, right? So I'm just hitting a bunch of points here. But to get back to the main thing, I guess I just, I do, maybe because I've gone through multiple deconstruction experiences, tend to be okay with the hard reality of owning and even valorizing, even sanctifying the inherent iconoclasm that goes into a life of faith, because God is always calling you to break down those images. And I've had to reimagine and re-understand divine experiences in my life and things that have happened, and these sorts of things that were very meaningful to me, that set me on a whole new path and gave me a whole new sense of my life meaning and purpose and direction, to have those 5 years later be like, oh, nope, sorry, that wasn't a thing, Yeah. And then like to have that happen multiple times, right, is sort of like, so I guess I'm just naming all that. And I'm saying that, yes, not everyone needs to feel like that the answer to all this is somehow like to just give up on any notion of stability or anything like that, but that there are ways of framing a lot of what I've said in social containers around development, education, Bildung, developmentally informed approaches to teaching, catechism and faith, and that really is appropriate to where people are at in life. And to also, I guess this is the point that I'm really getting at, is I think most people will be okay with that. People do, I think, eventually get not okay with challenging received images, symbols, rituals, paradigms, stories, myths. Right. And that's most of what I've had to bump up against in my own deconstructions and in, what's happening with people around me and the people I care about and how I relate to them and all that. And I guess I just always want to plug the idea that, like, when people are deconstructing, when they are going through something radical and a worldview shift, like, there's a default assumption in religious communities that this is a falling away. It's a regression. Right. It's a fallback. I forget. There's kind of
apostasy.
Yeah. Well, certainly. Yeah. Right. So, that's just, I think religious communities are misoriented around those sorts of life events. And I think if we were to take them much more seriously and be able to appreciate that they are the dynamic living moments in the evolution of faith, not just for individuals, but for society and what can come out of those experiences, we would be better off. And the last thing I'll say, because I'm rambling, is that I totally agree that we have this rich tradition to draw from, and we shouldn't, Goethe said, he who can't draw on 2,000 years of history is living from hand to mouth. So I'm not saying that down with all the idols of the past either, but we should also take seriously that part of what we now have available to us is all the other religious traditions, right? The Vedanta and Neoplatonism and Zen and, all these different traditions that, again, I think people maybe are a bit uncomfortable thinking about. It's like, well, yeah, we have tradition, but not those traditions, right? And I think that there is profound wisdom out there in a lot of different traditions that we might want to consider folding that in as well. So yes, how do we navigate the tension and between moving beyond the limitations of the past, but not throwing out the baby with the bathwater? That's a perennial issue. And how do we find a sense of stability in a continually dynamic world upending, potentially situation of flux? Perennial tension. But these are the questions that we should sort of be inviting the wrestling with, I think, as yes. I've heard you talk about things, and not just sort of, immediately precluding them from the religious life.
Yeah. And I'm really thankful for you sharing your perspective, Brendan, on this. And I'm glad, even, as opponent processing happens, that's where a lot of this growth takes place. If we are serious about confessing our own limitations, our finitude, and even, from a Christian, historically Christian perspective, we are confessing not just our finitude as an inherent feature of being human, but some sense of the depravity of our own condition to sometimes bend things towards our own will, to bend things towards our own selfish output. Then we have to be open to having these sorts of dialogues where people aren't necessarily eye to eye, but there's an openness to actually going, hey, I think there's growth happening. And I want to affirm that. I'm thankful for this dialogue, Brendan, and I'm thankful hopefully listeners experience it from wherever context they find themselves situated in as a positive thing that produces growth in their life, and allows them to say, hey, let me take my lenses off for a second, try some others on. And without doing that, I do think the sort of naivete that leads to the kinds of stories that are used in oppressive, abusive ways that don't have adherence to reality. If we're not checking up against this stuff, then we can be blindly participating in that. I just came to my head, maybe sometime, I don't want to throw this out there and impose upon them, but I was just thinking, boy, this really gets at, I think it'd be really fun, and maybe I can invite them into it. It'd be fun to bring John Vervaeke on and someone else like Paul Vanderklay to talk about the merits of kind of staying within a traditional religious tradition versus kind of Vervaeke's project, and what seems is in keeping with some of your project is to say, all right, can we take some of these and move them outside of the walls of traditional religious institutions? Which methodologies are better? Are there pitfalls? Are there things we can learn from both strategies? And I think that might be fun if John and Paul are listening. Open invitation. And I don't know if you'd be open to doing something like that, but I think it'd be an interesting dialogue.
Of course. That is the conversation, one of the major conversations that needs to be had. I've started to get into elements of that with my own conversations with John Vervaeke. I have a open correspondence meeting. I reached out, haven't heard back yet from Paul Vanderklay. So we were thinking of talking anyway, but this would be a topic that I think would be perfect to dive into. And so, yes, I'd definitely be open to that. One last thing I want to say too, though, is just that the images that we use of great value that come from our traditions, also, we're always deepening our understanding and our interpretations of them, right? I certainly, a minister of, say, 70 years old is going to have a very different conception of Jesus even than, a 5 or 7 year old, right? So and that we can take those changes seriously, and yet they still continue to persist and give that sort of continuity and stability, even as there is evolving, shifting notions. And then one of the challenges is how do we make sure that we're in harmony when someone's using this word in this way or this concept, and yet this is again a perennial issue in any religious context as people continue to work with the ideas and deepen in their understanding of them. But that seems to be, personally for me, the hardest thing to do myself with some traditional material is how to work with it from a new perspective or a new vantage that I can still affirm. Are we ever in a position to be like, no, that's totally, we can't do anything with that one, or what have you? Because people speak very eloquently often, including yourself, about drawing on this tradition and interpreting some of its ideas in a way that I find, yes, like I'm there with you, but then maybe enter a congregation and you're expected to affirm a certain notion, theological notion, or a creedal or a dogmatic notion. That's like, well, wait a second, that's not quite what I meant by God or salvation or love even. So, but yeah, so yeah. Yeah,
you've nailed it. You've nailed it right there. I think deepening is a really good word. I think that might be a word that you could find harmony between people within the traditional religious community still, and those that might be kind of trying to work outside of the bounds of that. Because deepening is, I think, a helpful picture that combats, I think, something lots of traditionally religious people are suspicious of. And I'm not saying it's accurate and good for them to be suspicious, but I'm confessing even my own suspicion of the kind of narrative that progress is any movement in any direction as long as we're moving away from the past.
Yeah, right. Of course.
And so that notion seems to be not helpful in many regards. So maybe there's a deepening. And like you're saying, the deeper we get in some subjects and some pictures, the more we realize, there might not be any goodness, truth, or beauty in this image to hold on to anymore. And but we only get that through these sorts of dialogues, Brendan.
Sure. And I think what the dynamic you just named also is to bring this back to the metamodern conversation. I think that's informing a lot of people's perspective in the sense of it was a very modernist notion of anything moving ahead and away from the past is good, and of course you get that deconstructed. But I think people in a metamodern position are certainly skeptical of that. They're skeptical of the skepticism of tradition as well, and so I think you're seeing a lot of openness and interest in traditional forms of religiosity for that reason. People don't feel like it has to be, again, that kind of false binary. So, this has been really wonderful. I really appreciate you having me on and getting to talk about this stuff.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for your generosity with your time too, as well. Before we recorded, you were asking how long this goes. Hour to hour and a half, but if we're really cooking, close to 2 hours. So I guess we must be really cooking because we're close to 2 hours. So thanks. And I'm serious. I would love to maybe find some other time to have continued dialogues, bring some other partners in that can help enhance and expand our framework here. This has been a blast, Brendan. Thank you so much.
That sounds great. At the very least, you're welcome on the Metamodern Spirituality podcast, and we can continue this conversation. But keep me posted. I'd be happy to talk with Paul and John for sure. Cool.
Great. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you, man.